Imagine standing on a mist-covered battlefield in the heart of medieval Europe. Tens of thousands of the most elite knights in Christendom clad in gleaming armor, riding mighty destriers and armed with swords, lances, and shields prepare to face an enemy unlike any they have ever known. They are confident, trained for centuries in the art of war, and convinced that no force could possibly match their strength and valor. But within 3 days, every one of them will be annihilated not by superior numbers, not by brute force, but by an enemy whose very name strikes terror across continents: the Mongols. The story begins in the early 13th century, a time when Europe was dominated by knights who were the pinnacle of military power. These heavily armored warriors were trained to fight in rigid formations, relying on their immense strength and the shock value of a cavalry charge. For centuries, such knights had dominated the battlefield, crushing foes who could not match their discipline or their armor. But the Mongols were not like any other enemy they had faced. Under the leadership of generals like Subutai, the Mongols had perfected a way of war that was built on speed, intelligence, and ruthless precision. Unlike the cumbersome knights, the Mongol horsemen were lightning fast, highly mobile, and masters of the bow. Each soldier could fire accurately while riding at full gallop, raining arrows down upon enemies before they even realized what was happening. But it was not just their skill with weapons that made them deadly, it was their understanding of fear itself. The Mongols used deception and psychological warfare to paralyze their enemies. Fake retreats would lure knights into traps. Sudden flanking maneuvers would encircle entire units. The very sight of Mongol armies moving with clockwork precision across the plains was enough to terrify even the bravest warrior. Over 3 days, the battlefield became a nightmare for Europe's finest. Knights charged again and again, attempting to break the Mongol lines, only to find themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Arrows fell like hail, striking armor and men alike. While hidden Mongol detachments attacked from the flanks and rear, communication among the knights broke down under the chaos, and fear spread like wildfire through the ranks. What was supposed to be a glorious clash of armies turned into utter devastation. By the end of the third day, 100,000 European knights, once the pride of Christendom, lay defeated, scattered, or dead, leaving the Mongols unchallenged and the European powers in shock. This was not merely a battle. It was a demonstration of a new kind of warfare, one where speed, intelligence, coordination, and psychological dominance mattered more than brute strength. The Mongols had rewritten the rules of combat, showing the world that even the most heavily armored knights could be destroyed in days if faced with an enemy who understood the art of war in a completely different way. As we explore this story, we will uncover how a relatively small but supremely disciplined force could crush an army of legendary knights, the tactics that made the Mongols unstoppable, and the lessons Europe learned the hard way. Prepare to witness one of the most shocking and instructive events in military history, a clash that changed the course of medieval Europe forever. In the early decades of the 13th century, Europe was a continent dominated by a class of warriors who had long been considered the apex of military prowess. The knights, clad in gleaming suits of chainmail and steel plate. These men were trained from childhood to fight with precision, discipline, and honor. Their lives were defined by the code of chivalry, and their identity was inseparable from their role on the battlefield. For centuries, European knights had been the ultimate symbol of military might. They were the heavy cavalry, the shock troops of medieval armies, capable of charging through enemy formations with a devastating combination of speed, weight, and swordsmanship across castles, towns, and battlefields. Tales of knights defeating entire armies became legend, shaping Europe's understanding of what it meant to be invincible in war. These knights were more than just soldiers. They were a statement of power. Every lord and king aspired to field them in great numbers, and knights were often the deciding factor in battles. Their armor, painstakingly forged by master blacksmiths, protected them from arrows, swords, and spears. Mounted on massive destriers trained for the chaos of combat, a knight could strike fear into even the bravest of foes. But as formidable as these warriors were, their strength came with significant limitations. Their heavy armor and weaponry slowed them down and made them dependent on terrain that could accommodate a cavalry charge. Their tactics, while effective against conventional European infantry, were relatively predictable and rigid. Knights relied on direct confrontation, discipline, and brute force principles that had served Europe well but would soon face a test unlike any before. At the same time, far to the east, a different kind of warrior was rising to dominate the known world. The Mongols, a nomadic people of the Central Asian steppes, were emerging as a force of unprecedented military efficiency and terror. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his brilliant general, Subutai, the Mongols had transformed from scattered tribes into a disciplined, organized army capable of overwhelming empires across Asia. Unlike European knights, Mongol warriors were trained from a young age to live and fight on horseback. They could ride for days without rest, survive in the harshest environments, and strike with deadly accuracy using their composite bows. Their tactics were built around speed, flexibility, and intelligence. They excelled in scouting, ambushes, feigned retreats, and psychological warfare, turning the battlefield into a landscape they could control entirely. The Mongol army was a marvel of organization. Each unit was structured in a decimal system, 10,000, and 10,000, allowing for precise control of thousands of men across vast distances. Communication was rapid and reliable, with mounted messengers relaying orders that could adjust strategy in real time. Discipline was absolute. A Mongol soldier was expected to follow commands without hesitation, execute complex maneuvers, and maintain cohesion even under extreme stress. These qualities made them a force unlike any European army had encountered. Where knights relied on individual valor and shock impact, the Mongols relied on coordination, speed, and the ability to outthink their opponents. The clash between these two military traditions, European knights and Mongol horse archers, was inevitable as the Mongols expanded westward into Eastern Europe, while knights were trained for the slow, deliberate engagements of medieval warfare. The Mongols had mastered a fluid, mobile style of combat. In many ways, the two armies were mirrors of their cultures. The European knights embodied the rigid hierarchy, chivalric code, and localized power structures of medieval Europe, while the Mongols embodied the adaptability, resilience, and relentless ambition of the nomadic steppes. This confrontation would not just be a battle of armies, it would be a meeting of two fundamentally different ways of waging war, each shaped by centuries of experience and environment. When these forces first encountered each other, the contrast was stark. On one side were the knights, encased in metal, forming rigid lines, confident that their armor and lances could turn the tide of any battle. On the other side were the Mongols, riding light, agile horses, their bows and arrows ready to strike from a distance, moving in ways that defied the expectations of European commanders. For the knights, speed was less critical than impact. For the Mongols, mobility and adaptability were everything. The Europeans believed that discipline and courage were the keys to victory, while the Mongols demonstrated that deception, coordination, and strategic foresight could render even the most heavily armed warriors vulnerable. The cultural and technological differences between these two forces amplified the tension. European knights were steeped in a world of castles, feudal obligations, and formalized warfare. They trained in siege engines, jousting, and direct combat, preparing for a style of war that rewarded strength and bravery above all else. The Mongols, in contrast, had no fixed fortifications, no permanent garrisons, and little reliance on heavy weaponry. Their lives demanded constant movement, and their combat style emphasized psychological manipulation as much as physical skill. By luring opponents into traps, feigning weakness, or striking where least expected, the Mongols could turn a seemingly straightforward engagement into a catastrophe for their enemies. This historical moment, the meeting of Europe's finest knights with the Mongol horde, was unprecedented. For centuries, European knights had believed themselves nearly invincible on the battlefield. Their armor, their horses, and their training created an aura of superiority. Yet, in just a few days, the Mongols would shatter this illusion, demonstrating that sheer discipline, mobility, and tactical intelligence could overcome even the most elite forces. It was not just a battle. It was a wake-up call, a demonstration that the rules of warfare were changing, and that the medieval European way of war, no matter how grand, was vulnerable to new, revolutionary methods. Understanding this context is crucial, because it sets the stage for one of the most shocking military encounters in history. It was not simply a clash of numbers or brute force. It was a confrontation between two very different worlds, two military philosophies that had been shaped by vastly different landscapes, societies, and priorities. The Mongols' ability to combine mobility, coordination, and psychological warfare with relentless physical skill would soon prove devastating. The knights, despite their armor, their courage, and their centuries of training, were about to face an enemy who could not be defeated by the conventions of medieval European warfare. In essence, this battle was the collision of two civilizations' approaches to war: the heavily armored, shock-driven, rigidly disciplined knights of Europe versus the lightning-fast, strategically brilliant, and ruthlessly adaptable Mongol horse archers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave a lasting mark on history, a battle in which 100,000 knights, celebrated as the ultimate warriors of their age, would be destroyed in just 3 days by a force that moved faster, thought smarter, and struck with terrifying precision. The European knights' world of castles, honor, and martial valor was about to collide with the Mongols' world of speed, cunning, and total domination. And in this collision, the lessons of adaptability, strategy, and psychological warfare would echo far beyond the battlefield, shaping the future of Europe's military thinking for generations to come. To truly understand how the Mongols managed to annihilate 100,000 European knights in just 3 days, we must first delve into their military genius. What set them apart from virtually every other army in history was not merely their numbers or courage, but the revolutionary strategies and tactics they employed. Unlike European forces, which relied heavily on rigid formations, shock cavalry charges, and brute strength, the Mongols approached warfare as a combination of mobility, intelligence, and psychological dominance. Every maneuver was calculated, every engagement choreographed, and every enemy encounter turned into an opportunity for manipulation. Superior mobility. The lightening of the steppes, perhaps the most striking feature of the Mongol army, was its unparalleled mobility. European knights, encased in armor and riding powerful but cumbersome horses, could cover only limited distances each day, and their speed was constrained by the weight of both man and mount. The Mongols, however, were light cavalry to the extreme. Their horses were smaller and sturdier, able to travel vast distances without tiring, and each soldier often had multiple mounts, allowing them to switch and maintain speed over long campaigns. A typical Mongol unit could move 60 to 100 kilometers in a single day, distances that would exhaust European knights in a matter of hours. This mobility allowed the Mongols to strike suddenly, appear where least expected, and retreat just as swiftly. Entire European garrisons could be bypassed, towns surrounded before a messenger even delivered news, and enemy forces left disoriented and unprepared. To the knights, used to battles fought on predictable terrain and at measured paces, this was nothing short of supernatural. The Mongols seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike with lethal precision, and vanish again, leaving devastation in their wake. Horse archery, death from a distance, but mobility alone was not enough. The Mongols' real weapon was their mastery of horse archery. Unlike European archers, who often required stationary positions to aim accurately, Mongol warriors could shoot with deadly precision while riding at full gallop. Their composite bows, crafted from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, allowed them to launch arrows with incredible force and range, capable of piercing armor that European knights considered nearly invulnerable. Imagine an entire formation of knights charging confidently toward what they assume is an easy victory. From a distance, invisible until the last moment, Mongol horsemen rain arrows down from multiple angles. The arrows strike with frightening accuracy, targeting horses, armor gaps, and exposed limbs. The knights, trained to engage in close combat, find themselves harassed relentlessly from afar. Each arrow carries not just physical damage but also a psychological blow, instilling fear and confusion. In many ways, Mongol horse archers transformed the battlefield into a deadly chessboard, controlling space and movement in ways the knights could never anticipate. Psychological warfare. The battle before the battle. Physical skill was only part of the Mongol advantage. Equally important was their mastery of psychological warfare. The Mongols understood that fear could be as lethal as any weapon. They employed terror as a strategic tool, spreading misinformation, exaggerating their numbers, and leveraging their reputation to paralyze enemies before a single arrow was loosed. Towns would surrender at the mere rumor of approaching Mongol forces. Armies would hesitate or break ranks, knowing that their opponent was not only skilled but seemingly invincible. Mongols often used deception to manipulate their enemies. They would stage fake retreats, leaving the impression that their forces were in disarray or fleeing in panic. European knights, trained to pursue a retreating enemy and gain glory in a decisive charge, would take the bait without hesitation. Once the knights broke formation to pursue, they would find themselves encircled, trapped, and under a deadly hail of arrows from multiple directions. What had seemed like a straightforward engagement turned into a carefully orchestrated disaster. This combination of fear, deception, and tactical brilliance ensured that the Mongols could win battles with minimal losses while maximizing the destruction of their enemy. Feigned retreats. The art of the trap among the Mongols' many tactics. The feigned retreat stands out as a particularly ingenious and devastating maneuver. European knights, believing in the honor of pursuit and confident in their superior shock power, would often charge after what appeared to be a fleeing Mongol unit. What they did not realize was that every retreat was calculated. The Mongols would retreat in controlled formations, drawing the enemy deeper into territory of their choosing, often toward concealed forces lying in wait. Once the knights were sufficiently isolated and overextended, Mongol detachments would attack from multiple directions, cutting off escape routes and creating chaos in the enemy ranks. The tightly disciplined Mongol army could change formations on the fly, encircle the pursuers, and strike with coordinated precision. Knights, whose strength lay in cohesion and frontal assault, found themselves disoriented and surrounded. Even the most experienced commanders could not adapt quickly enough, and their forces were decimated before they realized the trap had been sprung. The integration of strategy and tactics. What made the Mongols uniquely deadly was their integration of mobility, archery, psychological warfare, and deception into a single, cohesive strategy. Every battle was not just a fight, it was a carefully planned campaign, with scouts gathering intelligence, commanders communicating across vast distances, and soldiers executing maneuvers with absolute discipline. The Mongols did not rely on heroism or chance. They relied on meticulous preparation, adaptability, and an almost scientific understanding of warfare. In contrast, European knights were often bound by tradition and expectations. They trained to fight in a certain way, relying on armor, formations, and brute force. While courageous and formidable, they lacked the flexibility to respond to the fluid, unpredictable tactics of the Mongols. When faced with an enemy who moved faster, struck from a distance, and manipulated their perceptions of the battlefield, even the most elite knights were vulnerable. The resulting devastation. This combination of strategies explains how the Mongols could destroy 100,000 knights in just 3 days. They did not merely overwhelm with numbers or brute strength, they outmaneuvered, and outlasted their opponents. Every movement was deliberate, every arrow purposeful, and every feigned retreat a carefully set trap. By the time the European knights realized the nature of their enemy, it was far too late. The battlefield became a stage for Mongol mastery, where speed, skill, and psychological dominance created a catastrophe from which few could escape. In retrospect, the Mongols' military strategy was revolutionary. It was not just an evolution of existing tactics, but a complete reimagining of what warfare could be. Their methods emphasized the importance of mobility, intelligence, and psychological insight principles that would influence military thinking long after the knights had fallen. For the European forces they encountered, the lessons were brutal but clear. Courage and armor alone were not enough to survive against an enemy who controlled not just the battlefield, but the minds and movements of their opponents. By combining rapid movement, deadly horse archery, psychological manipulation, and ingenious tactics like feigned retreats, the Mongols created a level of battlefield dominance that few armies in history have ever achieved. They demonstrated that true power in war lies not merely in numbers or brute force, but in the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast an enemy. In the clash with European knights, this philosophy would lead to a 3-day catastrophe, reshaping the understanding of warfare for generations to come. The Mongol military strategy was not just a collection of tactics, it was a complete system, honed over decades of campaigning across Asia, that turned speed, skill, and strategy into an unstoppable weapon. In the following sections, we will explore exactly how these methods were applied in the fateful encounter with Europe's finest knights, leading to one of the most shocking and decisive victories in military history. To fully grasp the devastating effectiveness of the Mongols, one must understand that their success was not only rooted in superior tactics and mobility, but in an unprecedented level of organization and discipline. While European armies of the 13th century often relied on the valor, prestige, and individual prowess of knights, the Mongols built an army that functioned more like a machine than a collection of soldiers. Every man, horse, and weapon was part of a meticulously structured system designed for maximum efficiency, coordination, and lethality. At the heart of this system was the decimal-based military hierarchy, a structure that allowed the Mongols to control vast forces with remarkable precision. Units were organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each of these units had its own leader, responsible for discipline, communication, and execution of orders. This hierarchy created multiple layers of command that could operate independently yet remain coordinated with the broader army. For example, a unit of 10 soldiers would be led by a team leader, who oversaw training, discipline, and battlefield execution for that small squad. 10 of these squads formed a 100-man unit, commanded by an officer who coordinated multiple squads in maneuvers, ambushes, and attacks. A 1,000-man unit, called a minion, combined 10 100-man units under a single commander, who could manage large-scale maneuvers across open terrain. Finally, 10 minions formed a toman, the largest operational unit in the Mongol army, capable of independent strategic action on the battlefield. This structure allowed Mongol generals to control tens of thousands of soldiers as though they were extensions of a single mind. This organization had profound practical advantages. Orders could be issued quickly and efficiently, with each level of command understanding precisely how to execute them. Communication was reinforced through a network of messengers on horseback, signal flags, and prearranged codes. Even across vast distances, commanders like Subutai or Genghis Khan could adjust the positions of thousands of soldiers in real time, coordinating attacks, retreats, and ambushes with surgical precision. European knights, accustomed to rigid formations and slower, less reliable communication methods, could not respond fast enough to the fluid and dynamic Mongol movements. Equally important was discipline and training. Mongol soldiers were not simply mounted warriors. They were professional troops raised in a culture of constant preparedness and skill refinement. From a young age, boys learned to ride, hunt, and shoot with extraordinary accuracy. By the time they joined the army, they were capable of executing complex maneuvers under extreme stress without hesitation. Every soldier understood his role in the larger strategy, whether it was to engage in direct combat, harass the enemy with arrows, or execute a feigned retreat. This discipline extended beyond combat techniques. Soldiers were trained to endure long campaigns, often traveling hundreds of kilometers in harsh weather and difficult terrain. They could march, fight, and regroup with minimal support, relying on shared knowledge of strategy and battlefield organization. In contrast, European knights, though heavily armored and individually formidable, struggled with logistical challenges, supply lines, and coordination across units. The Mongols' self-sufficient soldiers, operating within a rigid yet flexible hierarchy, could sustain campaigns for months, striking unpredictably and withdrawing before the enemy could respond. The precision of the Mongol hierarchy was particularly evident in battlefield maneuvers. Entire tumens could split into smaller units to flank, encircle, or harass enemy formations, all while remaining in constant communication with the main army. When conducting a feigned retreat, a hallmark of Mongol strategy, soldiers executed the maneuver as though it were a single organism, drawing enemies into pre-planned ambushes without breaking cohesion. European knights, drawn by the apparent disorder of a retreat, would often charge recklessly into the trap, only to find themselves surrounded by disciplined, coordinated forces. The Mongols' organizational genius also extended to logistics and intelligence. Scouts and spies provided real-time information about enemy movements, terrain, and fortifications. Commanders could position their troops optimally, plan supply lines, and anticipate enemy strategies long before engagement. Even large-scale attacks, involving tens of thousands of soldiers across hundreds of kilometers, could be conducted with incredible accuracy and efficiency. This combination of intelligence, organization, and discipline made the Mongols more than just an army. They were a mobile, strategic powerhouse capable of controlling the battlefield before the first arrow was fired. Another critical advantage was redundancy and accountability. Each leader in the decimal hierarchy had clearly defined responsibilities, and failure to follow orders was not tolerated. Soldiers were trained to trust their commanders and execute maneuvers without hesitation. If one unit faltered, others could adjust and compensate, ensuring that the Mongol army retained cohesion under the most stressful conditions. This reliability made them extraordinarily resilient in the chaos of battle, a stark contrast to European armies, where individual valor often dictated outcomes and rigid hierarchies sometimes broke under pressure. The result of this organization and discipline was devastating when applied against the European knights. These elite warriors, accustomed to charging in tight formations and relying on individual heroism, were ill-prepared for an enemy that could operate as a single, coordinated entity across multiple layers of command. Knights found themselves outmaneuvered, harassed, and encircled by forces that seemed omnipresent and omnipotent. Their swords and lances were no match for the Mongols' combination of speed, distance attacks, and flawless execution of strategy. In practical terms, this meant that over the course of 3 days, European knights could not establish any sustainable foothold against the Mongols. Every charge was anticipated, every advance countered, and every retreat manipulated. The Mongols could disengage, regroup, and strike again with minimal confusion or loss. Their army operated like a living, breathing organism, each part understanding its role and executing it to perfection. This level of organization transformed what might have been a conventional battle into a near-perfect orchestration of destruction. It is important to note that this organizational advantage was not simply about numbers or structure, it was about control, adaptability, and foresight. The Mongols' decimal-based system allowed commanders to think in terms of both micro and macro strategy simultaneously. A commander could issue an order to a unit of 10 men, knowing it would cascade through the hierarchy and influence the entire battle, while also making high-level decisions that affected tens of thousands of soldiers. This dual-level thinking allowed for flexibility without sacrificing cohesion, a balance that European forces struggled to achieve. Ultimately, the Mongols' organization and discipline were the backbone of their military success. Mobility, archery, psychological tactics, and deception were all critical tools, but without a structured hierarchy and trained soldiers capable of executing complex maneuvers flawlessly, these advantages would have been far less effective. The European knights, despite their armor and courage, were simply unprepared for an opponent who combined strategy, coordination, and relentless discipline in a way the medieval world had never seen. When the Mongols faced 100,000 European knights, it was this organization and discipline that turned what might have been a bloody stalemate into a swift and total victory. The decimal hierarchy, precise communication, and rigorous training ensured that every move on the battlefield contributed to the overall strategy. Even the bravest knights, charging with the full weight of their armor and reputation, were funneled into situations where they could be isolated, encircled, and destroyed. The result was a catastrophic loss for Europe and a powerful demonstration of how an army that thinks, communicates, and moves as one can overcome even the most elite and seemingly invincible warriors. The Mongols had mastered the art of creating order out of chaos, and their army functioned as a single, coherent unit despite its immense size. This organization and discipline were not simply military attributes, they were a philosophy of war that elevated coordination, intelligence, and obedience above brute force. For Europe, this was a shocking lesson. Courage and armor could not compensate for the strategic genius and unyielding discipline of an enemy who had perfected the science of warfare. The battlefield is never just a neutral stage upon which armies clash. It is a weapon in its own right, and those who understand it best often dictate the outcome before the first blow is struck. For the Mongols, terrain and logistics were as integral to their victories as their bows, arrows, and cavalry charges. While European knights relied heavily on brute strength and the shock value of their armor and weapons, the Mongols understood that the land itself could be used strategically to magnify their advantage. By exploiting rivers, forests, plains, and supply networks, they transformed natural landscapes into instruments of war, turning the environment against their opponents while sustaining their own forces with unparalleled efficiency. European knights, despite their elite status, were inherently limited by the very qualities that made them formidable. Their heavy armor, sometimes weighing 50 to 60 kilograms when combined with weapons and horse gear, offered protection but at a significant cost. Maneuvering through difficult terrain, muddy fields, forests, hills, or riverbanks became a struggle. Horses, armored as heavily as their riders, could not maintain speed over long distances or uneven ground. A charge that would have shattered an enemy formation on flat plains could become an exhausting, disorganized ordeal if terrain intervened. Knights, trained to fight in set formations in open spaces, found themselves at a disadvantage in forests, marshes, or river crossings. Even their tactical superiority in direct confrontation could be neutralized simply by being positioned poorly in relation to the land. The Mongols, in contrast, saw terrain as an opportunity rather than a limitation. Their horses were smaller, more agile, and able to traverse rivers, forests, and plains without losing speed or stamina. Scouts surveyed the land in advance, identifying choke points, natural barriers, and advantageous positions for ambushes. Commanders could then position units to control these key areas, effectively dictating where and how the enemy could move. A river could become a barrier that slowed or funneled knights into waiting archers. A forest could conceal a hidden detachment ready to strike at an exposed flank. Open plains became an arena for fast-moving cavalry, allowing the Mongols to execute flanking maneuvers and encirclements with devastating effect. Logistics, often overlooked in medieval warfare, was another area where the Mongols excelled. European knights were heavily dependent on supply lines for food, forage for their horses, and reinforcements. Armies could march only as far as their resources allowed, and prolonged campaigns frequently led to exhaustion, hunger, and vulnerability. The Mongols, however, had mastered mobility and self-sufficiency. Their horses could graze on sparse terrain, their soldiers carried portable supplies, and their campaigns were planned with a remarkable understanding of endurance and distance. This allowed them to strike suddenly, move unpredictably, and sustain operations far from their home bases. One of the most devastating aspects of Mongol strategy was their deliberate targeting of enemy logistics. By cutting off supply lines, they ensured that European knights became increasingly isolated and exhausted as the campaign progressed. Without access to food, reinforcements, or rest, even the most disciplined and elite units became vulnerable. The Mongols would position forces to intercept messengers, destroy foraging parties, and block retreat paths, creating a sense of encirclement and inevitability. Knights, accustomed to relying on steady supply chains and predictable movement, found themselves trapped in a landscape where every step was controlled by an enemy who understood the terrain better than they did. Consider, for example, the use of rivers and marshes in Mongol operations. Knights attempting to cross or hold positions near rivers could be harassed continuously from a distance. Mongol archers, stationed on elevated banks or hidden among trees, would rain arrows on the armored cavalry as they struggled to maintain formation. Horses, tired and slowed by mud or water, became easy targets. What might have been a straightforward tactical maneuver for European commanders became a logistical nightmare when terrain and enemy strategy were combined. Forests and wooded areas were similarly exploited. While knights might attempt to seek cover or use trees as obstacles against cavalry charges, the Mongols turned these environments to their advantage. Scouts and light cavalry could navigate through dense woods with ease, ambushing enemy units at unexpected points. By using the forest for concealment, Mongols could force knights into narrow spaces where their mobility and numbers were rendered meaningless. The terrain became a tool for deception, manipulation, and eventual destruction. Open plains, often assumed to favor knights and heavy cavalry, were in fact exploited masterfully by the Mongols. These wide, flat expanses allowed for rapid movement, feigned retreats, and coordinated encirclements. Knights, expecting to dominate such terrain, would charge confidently, only to find themselves drawn into carefully planned traps. The Mongols could divide their forces, lure the enemy forward, and then converge from multiple directions with precision. Every part of the battlefield was mapped, every movement anticipated, and every position used to maximize the Mongols' advantage. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mongol use of terrain and logistics was its integration with psychological warfare. By controlling the environment, they heightened fear and confusion among European knights. Isolated units, harassed continuously, and forced into unnatural positions by the Mongols' manipulation of rivers, forests, and plains, became easy prey. The enemy was never sure where the next attack would come from or how to maintain cohesion. Every decision, every movement, was made under the looming threat of ambush, exhaustion, and encirclement. This mastery of terrain also amplified the effectiveness of other Mongol tactics. Feigned retreats, for instance, were far more deadly when conducted across rivers or through forests, as knights chasing the retreating forces became physically fatigued and strategically compromised. Horse archers could maintain distance, strike from concealed positions, and force the enemy into narrow or treacherous areas where heavy armor became a liability. Even supply lines, essential for sustaining prolonged engagement, were neutralized by controlling access to natural resources and pathways. In essence, the Mongols turned the battlefield itself into an extension of their army. European knights, despite their elite status and heavy armor, were rendered increasingly ineffective by terrain that favored speed, agility, and tactical flexibility. The Mongols' understanding of geography, movement, and resource management allowed them to fight not only the enemy but also the environment, bending every natural element to their advantage. It was this combination of terrain mastery and logistical superiority that allowed them to execute rapid, decisive strikes and maintain the operational tempo necessary to destroy vast numbers of knights in just 3 days. By the time the first skirmishes concluded, it was already clear that European forces were at a severe disadvantage. Exhausted from forced marches, harried by relentless archery, and strategically outmaneuvered by an enemy who controlled the land itself, the knights found themselves fighting on terms entirely dictated by their opponents. Every river, forest, and plain became a trap, a staging ground for ambush, or a corridor of destruction. They could neither rest, regroup, nor find security, and their reliance on heavy armor and traditional formations only made them slower, more predictable, and more vulnerable. In the broader context of military history, this mastery of terrain and logistics highlights why the Mongols were such a transformative force. They did not simply rely on the valor of individual soldiers or the shock power of cavalry charges. They leveraged the land itself, integrating it seamlessly with strategy, mobility, and psychological dominance. By doing so, they could neutralize the technological and martial advantages of even the most elite forces in Europe. The destruction of 100,000 European knights in just 3 days was not only a result of superior tactics, superior coordination, or superior weapons. It was also the result of environmental mastery and logistical foresight. The Mongols understood that battles were won long before soldiers clashed. By moving faster, planning smarter, and exploiting every advantage offered by the land, they controlled not just the enemy, but the space in which the enemy could operate, turning familiar landscapes into deadly traps and ensuring that every step the knights took brought them closer to annihilation. In conclusion, terrain and logistics were as much a weapon for the Mongols as their bows, horses, and swords. By exploiting rivers, forests, and plains, controlling supply lines, and forcing knights into exhaustion and isolation, the Mongols dictated the pace, position, and psychology of the battle. European knights, armored and elite though they were, became prey to an enemy who moved faster, thought smarter, and used the environment itself to dominate the battlefield. It was this combination of strategic foresight, environmental mastery, and logistical brilliance that helped make the Mongol conquest of Europe one of the most devastating and studied military campaigns in history. The clash between the Mongols and the European knights was unlike any battle medieval Europe had ever witnessed. What should have been a straightforward engagement for the heavily armored knights quickly turned into a catastrophic nightmare, as the Mongols applied their tactical brilliance with ruthless precision. Every move on the battlefield was calculated, every charge anticipated, and every action manipulated to sow confusion, exhaustion, and fear. The knights, though trained and elite, were drawn into a deadly web that they could not escape. From the moment the battle began, the European knights relied on their traditional strength. Repeated charges meant to break enemy lines and assert dominance. Knights, clad in heavy plate armor and mounted on powerful destriers, thundered forward with lances poised to impale the first line of Mongol warriors. To the untrained eye, such a charge was unstoppably an elite force, striking with maximum impact. But the Mongols had anticipated this. They did not meet the knights head-on. Instead, they employed hit-and-run tactics, retreating strategically while maintaining constant pressure. Mongol horse archers, riding with astonishing speed, would fire volleys of arrows at the advancing knights from a distance, staying just out of reach of lances and swords. These arrows were not random. Each was aimed with lethal precision at gaps in armor, the joints of horses, or exposed limbs. The European knights found themselves under a relentless storm of projectiles, unable to retaliate effectively while being forced to continue forward. Every step became a struggle, every charge an exercise in futility. Fatigue began to set in, both for man and horse, as they were drawn deeper into the Mongols' controlled chaos. This constant harassment was compounded by the Mongols' mastery of deception and feigned retreats. As the knights pressed forward, they often believed they had the upper hand, chasing what appeared to be a fleeing enemy. Yet these retreats were carefully orchestrated lures, designed to draw the knights into pre-planned ambushes. Once the knights were overextended, Mongol units hidden in forests, hills, or behind riverbanks would suddenly appear, attacking from multiple angles. Flanks were exposed, rear guards cut off, and what had begun as a confident advance devolved into confusion and panic. The Mongols' coordination during these maneuvers was nothing short of astonishing. Units communicated across distances using signals, flags, and mounted messengers, ensuring that every attack was synchronized. While the knights relied on individual valor and small-scale unit cohesion, the Mongols operated as a single, coherent organism. Flanking maneuvers were executed with surgical precision. One unit would draw the knights forward, while others swept around the sides, cutting off escape routes and encircling the enemy. Even the most disciplined knights found themselves trapped in a battlefield designed to exploit every weakness of their traditional fighting style. European commanders quickly realized that brute strength alone could not win this battle. Every charge seemed to accomplish nothing but draw them further into chaos. Horses grew tired from repeated runs under arrow fire, and knights struggled to maintain formation on terrain carefully chosen by the Mongols. Attempts to regroup or retreat were met with sudden attacks from unseen forces. Mongol warriors struck from every direction, exploiting gaps in armor and the knights' inability to respond to rapid multi-directional assaults. One of the most terrifying aspects of the Mongol tactics was their psychological impact. The knights, who had long believed themselves nearly invincible, were forced to confront an enemy that could strike, vanish, and reappear at will. Each failed charge, each unexpected ambush, and each volley of arrows eroded morale. Panic began to spread through even the most elite units. Soldiers who might have fought bravely in traditional engagements were now paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The battlefield itself seemed to shift against them, controlled entirely by the Mongols' superior strategy and execution. The coordinated attacks on flanks and rear were particularly devastating. As knights pursued retreating Mongols, units positioned for ambush would attack simultaneously from the sides and rear, creating chaos and fragmentation in the ranks. Horses, exhausted and panicked, became liabilities, trampling men and breaking formation. Knights who relied on the cohesion of their charge were now isolated, surrounded, and vulnerable. Mongol forces, meanwhile, maintained discipline and cohesion, exploiting every opening and relentlessly pressing the attack. The Mongols also used mobility to maintain relentless pressure. While knights could recover only slowly after a charge, Mongol horsemen could disengage, circle back, and strike again from another direction. This continuous cycle of harassment exhausted both men and horses, reducing the knights' effectiveness with each passing hour. What might have been a brief skirmish turned into a prolonged engagement where endurance and adaptability were paramount qualities that the Mongols possessed in abundance, but which the knights did not. Another key tactic was the manipulation of perception and expectations. The Mongols understood that European knights were trained to respond predictably to retreating or disorganized forces. By exploiting this, they could control not just the battlefield but the knights' very behavior. Pursuit of a fleeing unit would lead knights into traps, separation from their formation, and exposure to arrows and cavalry strikes from hidden units. Over time, these repeated deceptions compounded fear, confusion, and exhaustion, turning confidence into desperation. As the 3 days of battle unfolded, the Mongols applied these tactics relentlessly. Each day saw the knights attempting to charge, regroup, or counterattack, only to be funneled into carefully prepared kill zones. The combination of hit-and-run tactics, flanking maneuvers, and feigned retreats created a perfect storm. Knights were gradually worn down, not by a single decisive blow, but by continuous attrition physically, mentally, and strategically. By the end of the 3rd day, their numbers were shattered, morale broken, and formations destroyed. The battlefield was littered with fallen knights, broken horses, and abandoned armor, a testament to the Mongols' tactical brilliance. This battle illustrates a profound lesson in military strategy. Victory is often achieved not through the sheer strength of forces, but through the intelligent application of tactics that exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The European knights were powerful, Heavily armored and elite, but their strengths became liabilities in the face of a mobile, disciplined, and cunning opponent. The Mongols' use of hit-and-run attacks, precise flanking, and psychological manipulation transformed the battlefield into a controlled environment where every move of the enemy could be anticipated and exploited. Ultimately, the destruction of 100,000 knights was not simply the result of weaponry or armor. It was the perfect convergence of mobility, strategy, coordination, and psychological warfare. The Mongols controlled the pace of battle, dictated the battlefield's geography, and manipulated the knights' responses with unparalleled skill. Every arrow, every maneuver, every feigned retreat was part of a larger orchestration designed to maximize enemy losses while minimizing Mongol casualties. The outcome was a near-total annihilation of Europe's elite warriors in an astonishingly short period of time, 3 days, that would resonate through history as a lesson in the art of war. By studying these tactics, modern historians and military scholars gain insight not only into the genius of the Mongols, but also into the vulnerabilities of armies that rely heavily on tradition, strength, and predictability. The Mongols demonstrated that adaptability, discipline, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most elite and heavily armored forces, a lesson that echoes in military strategy to this day. In the next section, we will examine the aftermath of the battle, exploring the scale of devastation, the psychological impact on European forces, and the long-term lessons learned by medieval armies. The destruction wrought by the Mongols was not merely physical, it reshaped the understanding of warfare, strategy, and the importance of innovation in combat. The devastation wrought by the Mongols was not limited to physical destruction on the battlefield. Their greatest weapon was often the mind itself. In the chaos of combat, fear can spread faster than arrows, morale can collapse faster than lines of soldiers, and perception can shape reality as powerfully as steel. For the European knights facing the Mongols, the psychological impact was immediate, overwhelming, and, in many ways, as lethal as the weapons they carried. From the outset, the speed and precision of the Mongol army struck terror into even the most seasoned European warriors. Knights trained to expect direct confrontation and linear engagements were confronted by an enemy who could appear almost anywhere at a moment's notice. Mongol horsemen moved with unprecedented swiftness, circling, retreating, and reappearing as if the battlefield itself were alive with their presence. To the knights, it seemed impossible to predict where or when the next attack would come. Every arrow that struck, every sudden charge from the flanks, reinforced the sense of an enemy that was unseen, unstoppable, and omnipresent. This perceived invincibility of the Mongols had profound psychological effects. Tales of their previous victories, often exaggerated or deliberately spread through fear tactics, preceded their arrival. Entire towns surrendered before a battle was even fought, terrified by rumors of massacres that might occur. For knights, who prided themselves on courage and martial skill, this created an impossible dilemma. To fight was to risk annihilation. To flee was to invite shame or capture. Even those who were resolute in the face of physical danger could not escape the growing sense of inevitability. The belief that resistance was futile. Panic spread quickly across the battlefield, exacerbated by the Mongols' deliberate use of chaos and deception. Feigned retreats, sudden ambushes, and coordinated flanking attacks played not only on the physical vulnerabilities of the knights, but on their expectations and instincts. Each failed charge, each moment of isolation, and each sudden assault from an unseen enemy eroded confidence. Cohesion broke down as units became fragmented, leaders struggled to maintain order, and soldiers began to act out of fear rather than discipline. The Mongols did not simply defeat their enemies, they manipulated their reactions, turning psychological pressure into tangible battlefield advantages. The Mongols' terror tactics extended beyond the battlefield itself. Once a town or fortress fell, survivors were often slaughtered or scattered, leaving no doubt that resistance carried deadly consequences. Those who survived were sent as messengers to neighboring regions, spreading stories of Mongol speed, ruthlessness, and skill. The result was a continent-wide ripple of fear. European forces, even those far from the immediate battle, faced the looming specter of Mongol invasion. Armies hesitated, castles were abandoned, and alliances wavered as leaders struggled to anticipate how and where the Mongols might strike next. Fear became an invisible weapon, cutting through morale, unity, and the will to fight before a sword was ever drawn. For the knights themselves, the psychological pressure was devastating. Accustomed to the prestige of heavy armor and the shock value of cavalry charges, they now faced an enemy who nullified these advantages through speed, strategy, and cunning. Knights who had trained for years, who had fought bravely in prior campaigns, found themselves disoriented and terrified. The battlefield became a landscape of uncertainty, where every movement could result in death and every decision was fraught with risk. Courage, while admirable, was insufficient when pitted against an enemy whose very presence instilled doubt and despair. The Mongols understood this dynamic intimately and exploited it deliberately. By maintaining the perception of omnipotence, they ensured that their enemies' morale was shattered before the climax of battle. Few engagements were ever simply about swords and arrows. Most were psychological contests, where panic, confusion, and fear did more damage than any physical blow. Knights who might have survived conventional skirmishes fell victim not to Mongol arrows alone, but to their own fraying nerves and broken discipline. This psychological impact was compounded by the Mongols' selective ruthlessness. Few were spared once captured or cornered, ensuring that news of their victories spread terror far beyond the battlefield. Stories of massacres, executed commanders, and annihilated units traveled quickly across Europe, creating a culture of fear that influenced strategic decisions for years. European leaders understood that to resist the Mongols meant risking not only defeat but total destruction, and this fear often dictated cautious or delayed responses decisions that played directly into Mongol hands. The Mongols' psychological mastery extended to timing and unpredictability. By striking quickly, retreating deliberately, and returning when least expected, they created an environment where knights could not anticipate the rhythm of combat. Every day, every hour, and every decision was colored by the knowledge that the enemy could strike without warning, disappear, and reappear with deadly effect. Exhaustion, fear, and confusion compounded to create a battlefield environment where human limitations were as lethal as weapons. Even after the battle itself, the psychological scars persisted. Survivors, having witnessed the speed, coordination, and ruthless efficiency of the Mongols, often returned home traumatized, spreading tales of Mongol invincibility and shaping the perception of Europe's military elite. Future engagements were colored by caution and fear, as commanders sought to avoid the catastrophic losses that had befallen their predecessors. In this sense, the Mongols' most enduring weapon was not their cavalry or arrows, but the terror they instilled, which reshaped European military strategy and consciousness for decades. Ultimately, the psychological impact of the Mongols was as decisive as any physical factor on the battlefield. The knights were not only outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outnumbered, they were outfought, outpaced, and The collapse of morale, the rapid spread of panic, and the calculated use of terror ensured that even the bravest warriors became vulnerable to destruction. By the end of the engagement, the Mongols had achieved not merely a tactical victory but a psychological triumph, demonstrating the profound power of fear, perception, and disciplined intimidation in warfare. The Mongols' use of psychological warfare highlights a timeless principle: the mind can be the most dangerous battlefield of all. In annihilating 100,000 European knights over 3 days, they proved that strategy, speed, and precision combined with the deliberate cultivation of fear could defeat even the most elite warriors. Armor and courage alone were insufficient against an enemy who controlled not only the battlefield but the thoughts, expectations, and reactions of their opponents. In the following section, we will examine the aftermath of this monumental clash, exploring not only the immediate physical consequences but also the long-term lessons that Europe learned about mobility, strategy, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. The Mongols did more than win, they reshaped the very rules of engagement, leaving a legacy that would be studied, feared, and respected for centuries to come. The dust of the battlefield finally settled, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation. Tens of thousands of European knights, the supposed elite of medieval warfare, lay defeated, their armor shattered, their formations broken, and their morale obliterated. The Mongols, having executed their campaign with speed, precision, and ruthless efficiency, did not just claim a victory, they transformed the European understanding of war forever. The aftermath of this clash revealed lessons in strategy, mobility, and psychological warfare that would reverberate across the continent for decades. For centuries, European knights had been considered the pinnacle of military power. Heavily armored, well-trained, and highly disciplined, they were thought to be nearly invincible on the battlefield. Lords and kings relied on their knights as the core of their armies, confident that their shock value and prowess could overwhelm any opponent. Yet, the Mongol victory shattered these assumptions entirely. Europe learned a harsh truth: heavy armor and brute strength were no match for an army that combined speed, strategy, and mobility. Knights who had fought fearlessly in countless battles found themselves unable to adapt to a force that operated on completely different principles. The immediate military implications were staggering. European armies, long accustomed to static battlefields and predictable tactics, faced a new paradigm. Cavalry charges, which had previously defined the outcome of engagements, were no longer sufficient against highly mobile horse archers capable of attacking from a distance, retreating strategically, and striking again with relentless precision. Fortress walls and defensive positions, too, were rendered vulnerable when the enemy could outmaneuver traditional supply lines, isolate units, and strike unexpectedly. Military leaders across Europe were forced to reconsider long-held doctrines and reevaluate their reliance on knights as the ultimate weapon of war. The Mongols' victory also reshaped European tactics. Armies began to emphasize flexibility, reconnaissance, and intelligence gathering, recognizing that information could be as decisive as force. Mounted troops were retrained to focus on mobility and ranged attacks, attempting to mimic aspects of the Mongols' approach. Coordination and communication became increasingly important, as commanders sought to prevent the kind of chaos and encirclement that had decimated the knights. Though Europe would never fully replicate the Mongols' military machine, the lessons were clear. Adaptability and strategic thinking were essential, and rigid reliance on tradition could lead to catastrophic defeat. Beyond tactics, the psychological lessons were equally profound. The sheer terror inspired by the Mongols, their speed, precision, and seemingly supernatural ability to strike anywhere left a lasting imprint on European consciousness. News of the massacres and the scale of their victories spread quickly, instilling fear and influencing future strategic decisions. Armies hesitated, fortifications were reinforced, and alliances were reconsidered. Leaders understood that the Mongols were not merely another enemy, they were a force that could dominate through perception, mobility, and psychological pressure, changing the very way warfare was approached. The aftermath also revealed the importance of mobility over brute strength. European armies were often slow, heavily armored, and dependent on rigid supply chains. The Mongols demonstrated that an army could maintain operational superiority through rapid movement, strategic withdrawals, and the ability to strike unpredictably. Knights, whose advantage had always been their ability to charge and break formations, found themselves constantly outpaced. Entire campaigns could be disrupted simply by controlling terrain, cutting supply lines, and forcing the enemy to react to an agile opponent. This was a revolutionary concept for medieval Europe, where strength and honor often dictated strategy more than adaptability or speed. In addition to mobility, the battle underscored the importance of coordinated strategy and organization. The Mongols' decimal-based hierarchy, precise communication, and disciplined execution allowed them to orchestrate maneuvers that European commanders could barely comprehend, let alone counter. Flanking attacks, feigned retreats, and simultaneous assaults on multiple fronts demonstrated that success in warfare depended on planning, discipline, and adaptability rather than just courage or armor. European armies, while formidable in traditional engagements, were forced to recognize the value of strategic coordination and to reconsider how their units could operate as part of a unified system rather than as collections of elite warriors. Perhaps most importantly, the aftermath highlighted the power of psychological warfare. The Mongols' ability to instill fear, manipulate enemy perceptions, and control the pace of engagement proved decisive. Knights and commanders who might have fought effectively under normal circumstances were rendered ineffective when faced with an enemy that could anticipate their every move, strike from unexpected directions, and disappear before a counterattack could be mounted. This realization forced European leaders to consider morale, fear, and perception as critical factors in planning campaigns, concepts that were often secondary to brute strength in medieval warfare. The broader consequences for Europe were both immediate and long-lasting. Political leaders recognized that reliance on heavy cavalry alone was insufficient in the face of a new kind of warfare. Military reforms gradually emphasized combined arms, mobility, and intelligence, laying the groundwork for innovations that would shape future conflicts. Training programs for cavalry incorporated more focus on agility and ranged combat, while the value of reconnaissance and terrain assessment became central to strategy. Armies had to learn that victory required not just courage, skill, and armor, but adaptability, discipline, and awareness of both the physical and psychological dimensions of war. In a cultural sense, the battle also reshaped European perceptions of power and invincibility. The destruction of elite knights in just 3 days challenged long-held ideas about martial superiority, chivalric honor, and the role of individual valor on the battlefield. Europe was forced to confront the reality that even its most celebrated warriors could be rendered helpless against an opponent who thought differently, moved faster, and executed strategy with unerring precision. This humbling experience reverberated through the courts, battlefields, and chronicles of the continent, influencing military thought and historical records for generations. The Mongols' success demonstrated a fundamental truth. Warfare is not merely about the strength of armies or the valor of individual soldiers. It is about strategy, coordination, adaptability, and the ability to exploit both terrain and enemy weaknesses. By combining mobility, discipline, psychological manipulation, and tactical innovation, the Mongols overcame an opponent that Europe had long considered invincible. Their victory served as a stark reminder that the future of warfare would favor those who could think, move, and act with flexibility and foresight rather than relying solely on tradition or brute force. In conclusion, the aftermath of the Mongol victory over 100,000 European knights was transformative. The battle exposed the vulnerabilities of heavily armored, elite troops when confronted with a mobile, coordinated, and psychologically savvy opponent. It forced Europe to rethink military strategy, emphasizing mobility, intelligence, and psychological warfare over the brute strength and armor that had previously defined success. The Mongols' triumph did not merely destroy thousands of knights, it reshaped the very principles of war, leaving lessons that would influence European military thought for centuries. This battle stands as a timeless testament to the importance of innovation, adaptability, and strategic thinking in warfare. Europe, despite its knights, castles, and centuries of martial tradition, had been forced to confront an enemy that embodied a completely different approach to combat, one that combined speed, organization, psychological insight, and mastery of terrain. The lessons learned from this clash would echo through history, influencing not only medieval tactics but the evolution of military strategy across the world. The battle between the Mongols and 100,000 European knights was more than just a clash of armies. It was a confrontation of two entirely different philosophies of warfare. On one side stood heavily armored knights, symbols of medieval power and martial tradition. On the other, a highly disciplined, mobile, and cunning Mongol force that used strategy, speed, and psychological warfare to devastating effect. In just 3 days, the Mongols demonstrated that courage and brute strength alone were not enough to guarantee victory. They reshaped Europe's understanding of warfare, proving the power of adaptability, coordination, and environmental mastery over rigid reliance on tradition. This encounter serves as a timeless lesson. Success in war and in life often belongs not to the strongest but to those who can think ahead, move swiftly, and adapt to changing circumstances. The Mongols' triumph reminds us that innovation, strategy, and understanding one's environment can turn seemingly insurmountable challenges into decisive victories. If you were amazed by how the Mongols crushed Europe's elite knights in just 3 days, you're not alone. Their story is one of intelligence, strategy, and relentless precision, a story that continues to inspire military thinkers and history enthusiasts around the world. Understanding their tactics helps us appreciate not only history but the importance of thinking strategically, adapting quickly, and mastering every tool at your disposal. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most astonishing battles, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an epic story from the past. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which Mongol tactic surprised you the most, and can knights have ever survived such a relentless assault? Stay tuned for more videos exploring history's greatest battles and the strategies that changed the world forever.